Corporal Shaolin jogged along the trail at a steady pace. He'd run this route so often he could run it on autopilot. And as always, he thought of his fallen buddies. Pot Lee with his goofy smile, Pot Gonzalez always telling bad jokes to amuse the squad, Pot Tarn and that damn mustache he was always grooming, and his longtime buddy Sergeant Peak, who'd given him the nickname Monk when they were still in basic. It used to annoy him, but after seeing the nicknames he hung on other Marines, it could have been worse. And he got his revenge by making Abu stick as his nickname. They'd been battle buddies in recon for almost 6 years and been to hell and back for each other. And now they are all gone. Their transport had rolled over a mine that he missed while walking point. Or at least that is how it was in his head, that he missed the mine and he killed them. The guilt was unbearable and got him sent back for rest and therapy. He spent 6 months there, but they didn't want to release him straight back to combat. But he was going stir-crazy and convinced to let him do the equivalent of light duty by assigning him to a 3-man listening post on Tango 3's 4th moon. Normally a job for Navy techs, his company commander had pulled some strings to get him transferred there. And the 2 Navy techs were happy to have him. While atmosphere and weather were close enough to Earth norm that EVA suits weren't needed when leaving the bunker, it was still a dangerous place. It was like Australia on steroids, nasty insects, some so small you didn't know they were there until they bit. And it hurt like hell, but it wasn't fatal. Now those damn wasp-like things were. There were plants that were not only poisonous to the touch, or if dumb enough to ingest them, some of the damn things were carnivorous and big enough to consume fauna bigger than him. There was even a tree-like flora, the ginkgo, that had tendrils tipped with thorns that delivered a neurotoxin that would take down the rhino-like vogrox. If that wasn't bad enough, the damn things would wrap around anything that brushed one of those tendrils like an earth anaconda. And you could count on one hand the number of non-hostile fauna on the moon. They could still mess you up. They just didn't go out of their way to do so. Like hippos on Earth or buffalo. The bodies of water were even worse, with several ambush predators lurking in them. He was pretty sure some of the squirrel-sized clean would kill you if they could. Needless to say, the techs were happy to have someone to help keep them at bay in CPL. Xiao was having the time of his life exploring the area. It was like the bush training they did in the outback. All the nasty flora and fauna just made it more fun, except for the rocks. Those big flying bastards could ruin your day in a hurry. He wasn't sure if his combat armor was even strong enough to protect against those talons, let alone the teeth and bite force of the maw. Training in combat taught him to stop and listen when that happened. He ducked behind a rock and tried to get his bearings. After a moment of thinking, he confirmed he wasn't in a spot that contained any dangerous plants or animals. Crew of 2, able to carry 25 combat-ready Rukin or 100 tons of cargo. Limited range, which meant a warship in orbit or nearby. 2 pulse cannons forward-facing and a turret on the top with a single pulse cannon that had full movement to cover anything above the top of the shuttle. He then scanned the compound and muttered under his breath when he saw the Rukin inside it and saw them inspecting the several outbuildings. The door to the comm center was also open, and 4 Rukin were carrying out the bodies of his 2 comrades. They were also hauling gear to the shuttle. He still had a chance to prevent them from just taking up the equipment and accessing it that way. First things first, the communication system uplink needed to be cut off, and taking out the transmitting tower was the best way. Fortunately, it was just over a kilometer away, and he was able to reach it and wreck it within less than 20 minutes. But not before getting a coded message in Morse code sent out. Next was the shuttle, but he needed a distraction if he was going to get to it unseen. As he snuck down the sides of the valley, he saw something that gave him a great idea. He picked several pieces of a type of berry as he went. Once he was in sight of the perimeter, he cut a pair of fronds from a bush and put the berries between the fronds. He then used the butt of his knife to smash them into a paste. After they were crushed, he added a little dirt and mixed it together into a kind of paste. Hiding behind a large tree, he let out an imitation of the noise made by the 4-armed, monkey-like jackery. The cry echoed through the trees as multiple jackery responded to it. It wasn't long before they caught the smell of the berry paste. The berries were one of their favorites, and they would go apeshit over them. Before long, dozens of them descended on the compound and turned it a chaotic free-for-all. They fought with each other over the paste-covered pebbles, and when a few Rukin made the mistake of getting too close, they thought they were coming for the treat and attacked them. One of them made the mistake of shooting one. The cries made by the wounded Jokuri stopped their squabbling over the treats and focused on the threat. Rukin were swarmed over by angry Jokuri, and every Rukin that shot at them just brought them to the attention of the now extremely pissed-off Jokuri. Chuckling to himself, he snuck over to the shuttle and crept up on the lone pilot watching the chaos. Taking his knife, he stuck it into a vulnerable spot of the pilot and dropped him without a sound. Dragging him into the shuttle, he went to the cockpit, smashed the controls, and then smashed the databases from the listening post. He then took the rolled-up fronds and smeared what was left of the paste all over the shuttle interior. Dropping the fronds on the shuttle ramp, he ran for the tree line and climbed a particularly tall tree to watch the fun. It only took a few minutes before a newly arriving Jokuri caught a whiff of concoction inside the shuttle. He smiled as he listened to it, smashing things as it tried to get to all of the mixture. It was doing a far better job of wrecking the shuttle beyond repair than he had time for. He'd only had time to disable it, but they could do a workaround eventually. The Rukin had retreated into the comms center and shut the door. Over a dozen Jokuri and 2 Rukin were dead. The Rukin's hide was enough to keep the Jokuri from doing more than roughing them up. The 2 dead Rukin made the mistake of having their helmets off. Chuckling to himself, he thought about what to do next. He couldn't just assault the compound. Even in full body armor and his assault rifle, it was suicide. He had to break them into smaller groups first. CPL Shao guessed the Rukin leader would send someone to the tower. After all, the shuttle's comms were wrecked beyond repair, and they'd broken down the listening post's transmitting equipment, which he also wrecked inside the shuttle. He quickly but stealthily made his way to the tower. Knowing where he was going let him get into place before the Rukin found the way up to the tower. He hid behind a rock pile and watched. One of them started to inspect the tower while the other kept watch. It wasn't long before the one on watch moved off towards a copse of trees just behind the rock pile CPL Shao was hiding in. He slowly drew his knife, making sure to make no noise as he did. Waiting until the Rukin was looking the other way, he tossed a small rock into the brush. The Rukin immediately turned and took cover on the other side of the rock pile CPL. Shao was in. He took the same thing from the body as before, and made sure the Rukin hadn't figured out how to repair his sabotage. He was making his way through the jungle to get ahead of one of the pair searching the jungle. He chuckled when he heard the screams and sounds of weapons fire from near the fire he built. He wondered how many were close enough to the water for the one of the nasty things lurking there to grab them. He'd built his fire on a little raft and pushed it right to the edge of the water. He was glad it wasn't enough to cause an attack when he did. He'd hate to have to build it again. He finally found the first pair of Rukin after 15 minutes of searching and checked the map inside his head to figure out where he was. He got ahead of them and found just what he needed. He looked around until he found just what he wanted. Hiding behind a downed log, he began to strike it with the butt of his knife in a rhythmic manner, trying to get their attention, and he was rewarded a few minutes later. They were making their way towards him, but not quite where he wanted them. So he took a branch from the ground and hurled it off to the side. The sound it made when it hit a bush drew their attention, and they turned that way. He let them take about a dozen steps before rising up and threw 3 of the stones he'd picked up earlier. 2 of the 3 struck the tree he'd been aiming for. The Rukin were close enough to draw the attention of a horde of the extremely pissed-off wasp-like things. The Rukin made the mistake of flailing around at them instead of running. That just made more of them even more agitated and became the focus of the entire hive. With their thick hides on the back and sides, they could have made a run for it with little damage. But standing still let the horde find vulnerable spots to sting them in, and before long their venom began taking effect. He could tell by the way the Rukin began to stagger around before collapsing to the ground. He watched until they stopped moving, either dead or dying, before sneaking off as quietly as possible. Last thing he wanted was those wasp things noticing him. Once he was clear, he headed out to stalk the next group. He found them climbing the side of a hill, but the route they were on was slow going. Once again, he cut through the jungle and got ahead of them. As he got close to the top, he realized exactly where he was and almost turned back. "The hell with it," he muttered to himself, and slowly crawled to a spot that let him see the top of the hill. Just as he thought, nestled atop a nearby stone ledge was a very large nest. Even better, it was occupied by several hatchlings with 2 heads on long necks. He smiled, thinking they were going to find out they made a very big mistake by approaching the nest. One of the hatchlings noticed the Rookin and let out a loud cry. It was answered a few moments later by a piercing cry from outside the valley, and each time that it was repeated, it was closer. At the last one, he ducked under a bush and tried to stay as motionless as possible. A massive shadow passed over him, and he thought his eardrums would explode from the shriek it let out, seeing intruders by its nest. They raised their weapons and fired, but the rock's hide was too tough. It landed close enough for one head to dart forward and grab a Rookin in its jaws. The other head then grabbed the lower half of the Rookin, and they pulled him in half. The other Rookin began to backpedal and continue firing, but the rock just thrust out a wing. The Rookin went flying over the edge of the hill upon impact. Shao waited until the rock focused on feeding the unlucky Rookin to its hatchlings before sneaking down the hill. He was about halfway down before he began to make his way to the side the other Rookin had been knocked off. He found him 3 to 4 of the way down, smashed against a large tree and obviously dead by the unnatural angle of his neck and head. He took the knife and grenade from the body, but it didn't have the cord. He was just about to move on when he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. It was the 3rd patrol, and they had somehow made their way into the area of this patrol. Judging the distance and figuring out how long it would take them to reach the spot he wanted, he could just make it. Picking up the Rookin's body, he shouldered it and made his way downhill at an angle to get ahead of them. He was beat when he got there, but he'd made it in time. He went to a spot on the trail on the other side of a large tree with dangling vines. He set the body down and posed it on the trail. He then moved behind a large rock and watched. The 2 Rookin came around the bend in the trail and saw the body. They began to make their way towards, but suddenly stopped. After conversing for a minute, they moved at a much more cautious pace. It became obvious they were looking for an ambush, but they didn't know what to look for. Shao had that evil grin on his face as the Rookin began to walk under the ginkgo tree. The one in front brushed against a tendril, and it instantly wrapped around him. As it struggled, the tendril tightened its grip and began to lift him off the ground. The other Rookin pulled out his knife and rushed to help his friend, only to find himself entangled too. Shao just hoped for their sake that the neurotoxin killed them before the plant began to consume them. He watched for a moment as more and more tendrils wrapped around them and lifted them into the upper parts of the tree. Grabbing the helmet off the corpse and tying it to his harness, he went to stalk that last patrol. It was over an hour before he caught up to them, and another 10 to circle around a patch of that mud. He gently tossed the helmet into the middle of the mud patch. Luckily, it was too light to start sinking right away. He hoped they hadn't gotten too far ahead as he let out a yell, waited a moment, and did it again. By the approaching sound, they were just heedlessly crashing through the jungle. It was roughly 15 minutes later when he heard them staggering up the road. He stood as motionless as possible until they reached the spot he wanted. He took his knife and sliced the cord around the tree he was standing behind. The branch whipped forward and drove the knives into their chest to the hilts. Shao ran forward and finished them off. He took knives from 2 of them. The one in the middle didn't have one, probably left behind in his escape. None of them had grenades either. He took the other bushes and placed them along the top at random distances, so it looked like several other bushes were growing along the top of the rock wall. Hopefully it kept his blind from sticking out. Once everything was ready, he took a grenade, primed it, and hurled it over the sandy area to land in the jungle. The explosion echoed through the air and sent up a small puff of smoke. He then settled down to wait. After 20 minutes, he was starting to give up hope that they'd found his trail. but he began to catch just a slight noise of someone or something trying to move quietly through the jungle. He saw the first Rukin scouting ahead and then turning to wave the others on. Once they caught up, it looked down, and Xiao smiled at seeing them follow his trail. He wanted them to think he was a lousy shot, and they had little to worry about. At the pointman's signal, the other 5 spread out and began to cross the sandy spot. It didn't take long for them to stumble into the range of the things hiding under the ground. Sand sprayed up as the creatures burst up from their sandy lairs and began dragging the screaming Rukin down with them. He was about to step out when he heard the sound of someone walking the perimeter. It was the last Rukin soldier, which meant the leader and the co-pilot were either in the shuttle or in the comms bunker. He sat and watched the guard make his slow way around the perimeter twice before opening the door. Sticking to the shadows, he stalked the guard until reaching a good hiding spot. Then he waited for the guard to walk the perimeter again. He waited until the guard had passed his spot before leaping out, pulling the guard's head back and slitting its throat. It grasped at the slit in his throat for a moment before slumping down. Xiao crept over to the shuttle ramp and made his way inside. The co-pilot was trying to jury-rig the shuttle's comm system. After a quick peek toward the comms building, he took one of the grenades, armed it, and set it just inside the shuttle's hatch. He then sprinted behind a stack of boxes that provided cover from anyone leaving the comms building or the shuttle. He hoped their grenades weren't the type that only exploded on contact. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a spectacular explosion blew out the cockpit window and set the shuttle interior aflame. The door to the comms building slammed open as the leader ran out and towards the shuttle. It stopped in disbelief, and that is when Xiao fired 3 shots at the leader. It had impressive reflexes, diving for the ground at the sound of the discharge, but not fast enough. He took 2 in the side, but still had some fight in him. He struggled to get up and draw a weapon at the same time.
If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.